Hi, I'm Brooke Van Dam. Welcome to the LG Digital Broadcast Studio in the School of Continuing Studies at Georgetown University. I'm here with two New York Times journalists to talk about their new series of pieces about the long-term effects of torture on U.S. detainees. Matt Apuzzo is an investigative reporter who worked for the Associated Press until 2012, which is the same year he received a Pulitzer for his work on NYPD corruption and misconduct. He is also a beloved instructor here at Georgetown. You probably know Jim Risen from his book State of War, which looked at the CIA under the Bush administration. He has been with the New York Times since 1998 and has won 2 Pulitzers for his work. So thank you both for being here. I hope my introductions did justice to your great body of work.
Thank you.
So we are here to talk about the series of pieces that you've put together about U.S. detention, what went on, and now what some people are looking at, the effects of that. This is a huge undertaking in that you're reporting on 2 really sensitive subjects. You're reporting on torture, which we're still debating if we did it or not in some circles, and then mental illness in the form of PTSD for a lot of these people. So first of all, why on earth take on a project that big? And then once you decide to take on that project, how do you even start? So talk to us about that.
You want to start? Well, I mean, the good news is that we didn't set out to do that. Like, we didn't say let's do a massive project and fly around the world and do. It started really, really small. Jim and I had been looking into one specific waterboarding session of one particular prisoner, and in one of those conversations, there was just like a passing reference to the fact that wow. A lot of these guys ended up with long-term psychological problems, and so we were walking out of that interview, and I mean it was sort of we both kind of went, that's a good story, and I think we just sort of started nosing around at that, and frankly, like the enormity of it and the logistical issues didn't strike us at first, and so. It probably seemed a little easier than it ultimately was. So we had the benefit of ignorance at the beginning. We weren't intimidated by the scope of it because we didn't know it.
I think the most interesting, the kind of the epiphany for me, and I think for Matt too, was it seems like common sense to if you step back, from the macro level and think, okay, if you torture people, there's going to be damage to those people, and so sounds very commonsensical. But what struck us as we started to get into it was that nobody in the U.S. government and nobody outside the U.S. government had looked into this, and that was a reporting problem for us. It was like there's no government report to try and go get leaked to us. There was no study. Nobody had done what we were doing. And so at first we said, how are we going to do this? And then we realized that's why this is so important, is that nobody's done it. And it's why, this is something we should. And so we got, first we got frustrated by that, and then we got excited by that. So.
Yeah, there was actually a moment where I think we hoped that there was some secret report, right? Both Jim and I have, our stock and trade is just a lot of just like prying secrets loose. So I think there was this moment where we hoped we could there was got to be a secret report out there somewhere that has documented this, and that'll make it all easier. And I remember we were in an interview and we thought for sure they were going to point us to where this document existed, and they were like, no, nobody's ever done this. This doesn't exist. And it was like we were walking back to the bureau, and it was like halfway home we were sort of like, God, that stinks. And then only like halfway there, we're like, wait a minute, no, that's awesome. Like, this is fantastic. Like, so we'll just do it. And that was that, like, Jim, it was like an epiphany. And you realize that, the story actually has the potential to kind of reveal one of the mysteries as opposed to just being, well, we got a hold of this secret document.
Yeah. When did you start this story?
Was it spring? So what is it, about 6 months?
Yeah, I think I would say about then. Yeah, I mean, I think we were like nosing around at it early in the year. I was going back and I was looking at some emails talking about maybe, should we do this or should we do this in like late February, but I think we probably really focused on it starting the early spring.
So just starting the first article, which was called How U.S. Torture Left a Legacy of Damaged Minds, just in the first few paragraphs, we're meeting sources. One was from Morocco, one was from Slovakia. I mean, how are you finding these people who are now spread out all over? And how do you reach out to them? You know, that seems like a huge task to sort of
Right.
find these people and then talk to them and create a rapport with them. So how did you create that?
I mean, that was the trick. You know, we had the good thing is that everybody at this point who's been in Guantanamo, for the most part, has had access to some lawyer, right? That's not true necessarily about people who are in the black sites. So I mean, we started with the people who were in the CIA program, and that list is available on the in the Senate interrogation, the Senate torture report, and then we started with a list of people, you know, from Guantanamo, and we just started calling lawyers, and then for the people who were at the CIA sites, we just started trying to find these guys. You know, some of these guys had kind of just gotten off the grid. You know, were released with no charges after being held for a year or so. And, you know, a lot of great work had been done on this by other journalists, by, you know, human rights groups, by lawyers. You know, the Senate torture report was a good guide. And so I think we just start talking to people, and sources beget sources. And then, you know, pretty soon we had a long list of people we kind of knew we wanted to talk to.
Yeah, I think the first big debate we had was what would be the universe of people that we were going to look at. What was the group? Would we limit it just to people who were on that list of 39 people officially acknowledged to have been tortured by the CIA? Or would we expand beyond that? And if so, how would we expand beyond that? And we had a lot of different options on that, and we eventually decided to include people both who were in the CIA program and people who were at Guantanamo. But that was probably one of the most difficult balancing acts we had to face, was how do you judge who, you know, because we decided we weren't going to get into Abu Ghraib, for instance, or some of the other, you know, prisons.
Bagram, Camp Bucca.
Yeah, we got into Bagram a little bit, but not in this kind of a comprehensive way. So the good thing was that, as Matt said, there's a list of the people who went through the CIA program, both who were tortured and then the larger number of people who were actually held by the CIA. But the problem with those people is that a lot of them were released very early on, before they were before the black sites were closed in 2006, when President Bush moved the remaining people who were held at the black sites to Guantanamo. And so all of the people who had been released prior to that by the CIA were really had almost disappeared, and so a lot of them were very difficult to find.
So our ethics and journalism class is sitting here watching this, and one of the questions that one of our students had was, how do you interview people who have something like PTSD and now are dealing with the mental health consequences of this? I mean, that's a really intense thing to go through, and then how do you keep your own personal feelings out of it? Because even reading these stories is traumatic as a reader, so I can't imagine hearing these stories. So talk to us about what that looks like.
Why don't you talk about Jim's first visit became its own story about Suleiman, who was tortured.
Yeah, this guy who was tortured by the CIA and then held at a black site in Afghanistan, and then was sent to Bagram for several years. There's a guy named Suleiman Salim, and he was from Tanzania. And I met him in Dubai, and he was deeply, deeply troubled. And he'd already, he'd been out for several years, but he was still dealing with, obviously, just obvious that, as soon as you meet him, dealing with a lot of psychological problems. And he kept breaking down in my interviews with him, and I had to stop the interviews. At one point, he rushed out of the room and wouldn't come back to see me for a couple days. And at another point, he said, "Well, you ask the same questions that the CIA asks." And so it's a real balancing act. How do you get to the truth without re-traumatizing these people? And it's it kind of makes you feel guilty, but at the same time you realize that it's difficult for them, but in a way it's also good for them, because I've had people tell me that they think it's in some ways it can be therapeutic, but it's also very difficult, and it can re-traumatize people. So it's a balancing act.
Yeah, I mean, I think we spend some time talking to people who do this for a living. I mean, who interview torture survivors or who work with traumatized people for a living, and it just makes you think about how you frame your questions. So, I mean, as Jim says, when we want to talk about people's biography, right? I mean, so we want to know, well, tell me about your childhood, tell me about, and then why did you go to Afghanistan, and then why did you go into Pakistan after 9/11, and what put you in the situation where you were picked up. You can imagine that that's exactly the sort of line of questioning that American interrogators are going to have. So being conscious of that is one thing. The other thing is, one of the things that we were advised to do was, in order to give the people we're interviewing more kind of control or more a sense of power, so they don't feel like they're being interrogated, was say, would it be okay if we talked about what happened in the interrogation room? And so it's like asking permission to ask a question, but you're still asking the question, like what happened in the interrogation room, but you're asking in a way of would it be okay if we talked about that? And then he said, well, I don't like to talk about that. He says, well, what is it about what happened in the interrogation room that makes you uncomfortable? What is it about what happened in the interrogation room that makes you still feeling uncomfortable today? I remember it was something like 6 hours with one guy in Morocco before he finally talked about, the biggest trigger for his flashbacks. And it was just a slow process. And I think that's, that you just have to remember that you're dealing with human beings and you're dealing with people, and, they're talking, and mental health has a stigma in the United States, but it certainly has a stigma in the Arab and South Asian world, and so we just need to be cognizant of that.
Yeah.
And I think this is the answer that Matt's really saying, is what it requires is a lot of patience, and that, along with the logistical challenges of doing something like this, really is one of the reasons it took a long time. You couldn't have done this quickly, this project, I don't think.
So you brought up something that I think is really interesting. This story, because of the nature of it, really has a global audience. So how do you go about, so you've done all your reporting, you've talked about these sensitive issues. As soon as that's up on the website, it's not only an American audience that's reading about the torture that our government did, it's something that could be read everywhere. So
yeah, the
do you
people
then,
we wrote about read it.
So does that change then how you go about writing your story, knowing that this person's friend could read it, or uncle or grandfather?
I don't think so. I mean, I think certainly at the Times, but I think if you're at a news organization that's writing about global issues, you always are sort of cognizant that you can't necessarily write about things just through an American lens, right? I mean, particularly when your subjects are overseas. But I don't really think about when we were writing, I never really thought about how are the people we're writing about gonna react to that. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't really, the deal is, right, you agree to tell me your story, you trust that I'm gonna do it justice, and then I gotta kind of put your feelings about the story out of my mind while I'm writing it. And so I don't think it changes the way you write, but I do think in this day and age, more stories are global than ever before.
I think there's also just generally, I know this has been true for me for the years I've been at the New York Times, and I was at the Los Angeles Times before that, is if you're at a large news organization, or if you're writing a book or whatever, you have, it's a privilege, but it's also an obligation to be as careful as possible. And I think all you can do on a story like this is write it as well as possible, report it as well as possible, and then be as careful as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I spent 3 days on the first story, which was 6,000 words in the end, something like that, footnoting every sentence. Like, this is where this piece of information came from. I mean, how many sentences in a 6,000 word story? And then sent it around to Jim and Sherry Fink, our other team member, and to our editor, basically saying, there's attribution throughout, but you need, I've checked this quote. This attribution tracks what's in the notes. We can make this statement because this is documented here, and and as Jim said, you catch things. Oh, no, that was 2004, not 2005, and you just sort of have an obligation to try to be as careful as possible.
One of the problems, I think, just reporting-wise, with I think the basic problem we encountered was because there was no, as I said earlier, because there was no government report on this, no study, no official, not even an unofficial study. I mean, the NGOs, the outside human rights groups have not done this. The lawyers for the defendants haven't done this. The International Red Cross has not done this. No one has done this. And so I think we saw that as an amazing opportunity, but at the same time, it's a challenge reporting-wise. Okay, how do you prove a pattern of this kind of problem when no institution at all has ever looked at that to see if there's a pattern before? And so I think that was the basic problem we had to encounter and to deal with, and I think we did it as best we could.
And that means being honest with your readers and saying, here, hey, here's some things we don't know, right? I mean, we don't know the full scope of this. We don't know even have a clear denominator of the number of people who went through these programs. But here's what the reporting we've done. Here's what it's based on, and here's what we found. And there are unknowns, and I just think that's part of.
Yeah, but I think in the end, we felt very confident that we had found and proven at least a strong pattern of causation between torture and some evidence of some strong evidence of long-term psychological damage.
And as Jim's point, of course, I mean that makes so much sense. But you have to go, because I mean that's what happened to our own soldiers who went through POW camps in Korea and Vietnam and World War II, who were tortured or who were subjected to interrogations, harsh interrogation. Of course, there are going to be long-term psychological problems, but you have to approach your story assuming that you're wrong and that you're going to somebody's going to immediately be like, no, that's not true. And so if you're going to make an assertion, I think it's just and our editor was really good about just saying, how do you prove that, and which is what you want.
Yeah. That is a great segue to my final question, which is we have a master's program here at Georgetown, which you teach in, Matt, and you two have sort of reached the pinnacle of what a lot of students starting here want, which is I want to write stories that make a difference, and you both have done that. I would argue that this piece as well is another part of your legacies. So what advice, you're at the other side of what they're hoping to get to, what advice would you give to students wanting to write journalism or even do television journalism that really makes a difference?
Go somewhere far from your comfort zone and go cover a local police department or a sheriff's office or a school board or something for a local news outlet, and do it well and throw yourself at it, because if you want to do stuff that makes a difference, that's what really makes a difference in people's lives. And it's we as an industry aren't doing it as well as we used to, and we got to do better at it. And there's no better training ground. the single thing that I think editors at all news organizations look for is a proven track record of breaking news and writing things that tell me something that I didn't know, and ideally something that somebody didn't want me to know. And you don't go and start doing that at the New York Times. You don't start doing that at the LA Times. You start doing that by cutting your teeth and learning how to cover a school board, a police department, courts, and that stuff really does matter. And when people can walk into your newsroom when you write a story they don't like and tell you, I don't like your story and you're wrong and you're terrible, it is a better connection to your audience than somebody tweets at me that I'm an awful human being. It makes you feel more connected to your audience.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything Matt just said. When I started, it was a much different time, and a career model for a reporter is completely different today than when I started. But it's still, what Matt said is basically what I did. I think I think one of the problems, I don't believe you can start out in journalism as an investigative reporter. It's something you have to, as Matt said, you have to learn the basics of the craft first. And you do that by covering, local events or local news or something. But if you do that with a skeptical eye and with a sense that you want to find out things that other reporters aren't finding out, then you will have the right personality and the right traits that will lead you eventually to investigative or enterprise reporting. And I think that's, you have to be a little bit rebellious to end up doing this kind of thing.
Because there's no difference really between quote unquote investigative reporting and reporting as far as a craft goes. It's all about like your skepticism and your curiosity and your persistence, right? I mean, in the end, I like to say it's I have 3-step process for doing journalism, right? I talk to people, write down what they say, and then tell others. That's it. And investigative journalism is just being a little more skeptical about what they're saying, talking to way more people, and thinking about what maybe other people are missing. And but you got to learn how to do the basics and the core stuff. And I think that's what's so important.
But doing a beat at a local level leads you to stories that could be a scoop or an exclusive, and that will be, as a young reporter, your first experience with what really is investigative reporting. So.
Well, thank you both so much. And that is all for today. And make sure and check out that piece on New York Times, and you have a couple more in the series coming out in the next few weeks. So, thanks.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.